them.
Oh.
The topic is...
Tell me the number again. 206.
206, 523...
0800.
Yeah. The topic is self-regulation and attachment. Okay, basically it's an attempt to look at Reich's concepts of self-regulation and it's not going through?
Hello?
Hello?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry we're a little late, but it's spring here and the subways are down.
And everyone's talking about the producers.
And everyone's talking about Mel Brooks and the producers. Dr. Schiff won't care since Dr. Rothenberg and I always refuse to tell him any good jokes because they're wasted on him.
Well, good morning. What do you mean the subways are down?
No, they're just all rerouted, so people are using that as an excuse to get here late.
I understand. Well, glad you all came.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So anyway, the people were just asking what we're going to talk about this morning. Mostly we were talking about Mel Brooks and the producers.
An ergonomic perspective on comedy.
Yeah, well, that might be interesting. Yeah. Anyway, so I was explaining that we're going to talk about concepts of self-regulation and contactfulness, Reich's concepts of contactfulness or energetic contact, and in relationship to John Bowlby's and Daniel Stern's, Mary Ainsworth's concepts of attachment, the concepts of attachment and a secure base. And so that what I said, the model that Dr. Schiff and I talked about today was that we'd each give a relatively brief presentation on this material from our perspective, and then have some discussion either back and forth from here to there or questions as presented. Is that okay? Yeah.
It's okay with me.
Okay. So actually, just as a sort of intro to this, that a lot of this specifically came out of my interest and early on the challenge by Dr. Rothenberg, Michael Rothenberg, to the fact that when I tended to present the child development models, I didn't really anchor it very clearly in Reich's model. And then when I began to look at that, interestingly, what emerged was that Reich actually doesn't give a great deal of detail about a specific developmental model. I mean, there's implications and you can extract it, but even in Neil's work, in A.S. Neil's work, there isn't a detailed developmental presentation of how the child moves through phases. There's more general concern with overall issues of the organism and issues of how armoring takes place and what kinds of social environments and interpersonal environments foster greater independence, greater contactfulness, greater health. Less armed and more self-regulating organisms. So in the context of that, and responding to Dr. Rothenberg's challenge at one of the lectures series, one of the symposiums that we did out in Seattle some years ago, actually looking back at my notes, it was back in 1990. Time is moving ahead rapidly. I actually presented and prepared a presentation on a projection for a model that would address some of these issues. And then in preparing for this, I went back over that and added some additional notes. Since then, I've become more actively involved in the work of Bowlby and begun to really see the relationships between John Bowlby's work and Reich's work and ways of unifying that. So that's the origin of this. So let me just read through some of this and comment, and then hand it over to Dr. Schiff, and then over to the group. Okay? I think it's possible to construct a developmental model for human life and its behavioral expression based on Reich's work. this is basically, as I said, a response to Rothenberg's criticism. We're always looking at humans. I mean, the first problem is that we always look at humans, a human organism, really, and I think this is very important in terms of one of the insights that Reich has, but it also makes it difficult, that we're looking at humans and human development in an armored sociocultural context. And what that means is that we are at a disadvantage in that we're trying to come to some insights as to what is a healthy, normal range of function, and yet we are looking at it continuously from the context of both ourselves as individuals who, even if we, through years of work or whatever, have achieved some degree of openness or less armoring, we're still essentially, and we can't be as arrogant as to assume that we are not ourselves subject to the problems of being armored organisms. There should be no sort of arrogance and assumption that because we're involved with orgonomy, we're no longer armored organisms. It's possible that that's not a realistic possibility. Dr. Sovey and Rothenberg often concluded that probably if we were genuinely unarmored, we couldn't make it down the street. That was Dr. Sovey's letter. If I got you to be completely unarmed and put you out on the street, you wouldn't make it down to the corner. So I think we have to look at it in that kind of setting and with those kinds of parameters in what we're looking at. So we're looking at an armored population, that's our sample when we build this, not to mention that we as observers are also hampered by our own armored natures. The result of this is that we cannot see clearly or easily what developmental process might be in nature. And I find this very interesting that in all my years of lecturing, not only to people involved with with interest in Reich's work on orgonomy, but in my lecturing and teaching at various colleges on human development, I often will use and draw on and make very active references to humans in nature. And people have a hard time understanding what I mean. Right? And I have to keep explaining, and they have a very difficult time holding on to that. That I mean human organisms who live in a natural setting, basically meaning hunters and gatherers, simple people who are operating as hominid primates, great apes, in a natural environment. Now, we have a good deal of information about that from anthropological, archaeological evidence, and we have a good deal of it from contemporary or the ethnography of the last 100 years, which gives us some sense of what hunters and gatherers are like in nature. But when we talk about this, people don't quite get it. I'm not talking about you or I going out into nature and like in the 60s and becoming, free. That's not probably, as most people in the 60s found out, that's probably not possible. But humans in nature are not something to romanticize or sentimentalize about. They're, to some extent, a laboratory or a database for looking at how the organism works. Along with that, we can look at our closest, relatives, the other great apes in nature also, which gives us some idea of how, large primates operate in nature. And that is, in a sense, useful to the extent that we can see it, and most of us have a great deal of difficulty with that. Clearly, any model that is built on the work of Reich must have at its core the idea of self-regulation, and by self-regulation, specifically, it's the self-regulation not of just this is often a mistake, I think, that's often made. So we talk about self-regulation, there's a tendency to assume that what we mean by self-regulation is regulating the behavior of the organism. And this is a very subtle point, that what Reich means by self-regulation, and I think even Neil didn't always get this, what Reich means by self-regulation is the regulation of the energetic pulsation of the organism. Not necessarily, because in some sense we're not sure what a self-regulating organism's behavior would actually be in a natural setting. I think based on evidence from looking at humans and nature, what we know about that, we can build some ideas about that, but even that has to be, mediated by the reality of what we're looking at. But keep that in mind. It's not, often the mistake about self-regulation is that it's simply a question of letting people do what their impulses are doing. That becomes a real distortion, particularly what became prevalent in the American response to self-regulation, which became license, as A.S. Neal would call it, which is do your own thing. And again, the real issue here is the economics of energy and pulsation. And so when Reich talks about self-regulation, it's the series of behaviors and interactions that maximize the energetic metabolism of the organism, the core of the organism. Okay, so we have to really keep that at the center of this. Okay, and the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is, and Reich points this out, is, and I think this is important in terms of Bowlby's work, as I'll move towards it, is that humans, most of us, live in complex sociocultural settings. So that very nature of that kind of experience is very, very often debilitating. And I recently have spent a lot of time thinking about this and looking at this, which is that essentially, in one sense, we all are armored organisms to some degree if we've survived in this society and are not psychotic. But we're also constantly forced, and that there is probably no way to escape living to some degree compulsive, mechanical, mechanistic, compulsive lives. That we live in a compulsive society. Our social structures, our cultural structures are compulsive, compulsory and compulsive. And this also fosters and supports and encourages armor as a way of sustaining yourself in an extremely uncomfortable, unpleasant environmental circumstance. So that, again, what children have to learn to function in our society is to tolerate greater levels of compulsion or compulsory operations. In one sense, the criticism of schools becomes, even in the most liberal kinds of child-centered school settings that are not very, very abusive, they are highly compulsory. Not only in terms of you have to be there, you have to come, you got to get there, even if they have some, they're not that strict, you still got to get there basically on time. I mean, my daughter goes to a relatively open child-centered school, and there's a lot of compulsion. And similarly, what happens, which is often even more confusing, is that in more liberal settings, children are first encouraged not to respond competitively and compulsorily, until they get to about fifth grade, when the pressures then are, well, you got to get ready for, the future. So now you got to learn to take tests, you got to learn to compete, you got to learn to do this, and you better learn by next year. It's that kind of message which I think becomes really often disruptive because there's a real conflict or confusion. And kids who are fairly honest will often turn around and say, I don't understand. Why is it different now? Last year I didn't have to do my homework. This year I have to do my homework. So you sort of say, yeah, that's right. It's the way it is. But they see the incongruity or the lie to it on some level. But part of it is that what they're adjusting to is the fact that they're going to have to respond and operate in far from a self-regulating situation, which also produces a profound feeling that one's impulses and regulatory, self-regulatory, energetic pulsation is profoundly interfered with. To the extent that we can maintain that in some more open and at least more honest way, I think can help the organism. And I think finally, what I wanted to look at then was, what I looked at that time, before I get into issues in relating this to Bowlby's work, was building a model developmental model based on Reich's work. And with that, what I did was first to look at the concept of in nature, as I said, as a key to this, that we must first explore what the concept means and demand of any model building. In other words, it has to be a model that is drawn from looking at the organism in nature to the extent that we can see it, or to as much as we can see. And then we must really develop data, which I think is available, to look at whether self-regulation functions in nature. And I think what happens when one looks at humans in nature, the data that we have, whether it's hunting and gathering people, Cronin, or other groups, is that self-regulatory processes do operate, and I think you can identify them very, very clearly and isolate them very clearly. So I think there is without going into it in extensive detail, there's a really strong database for looking at self-regulatory processes in nature and seeing them there. So that when one looks at hunters and gatherers, we see that they do operate to a very large extent in a self-regulatory capacity. As Reich pointed out, I think very rightfully and very accurately and without sentiment, that doesn't mean that most of the societies we look at, even hunting and gathering societies, don't already have armored organisms, and that there aren't distortions and there aren't certain compulsions. In one sense, social organization rationally requires a certain level of compulsion. There are pressures, there are social demands. That is probably rational and healthy. Compulsive, social organization is different, where one is not just pressured by the social necessities, the environmental necessities, to translate that into social behaviors, but where one is, forced of necessity to do it whether you like it or not, so without any reason necessarily, or without any answer as to why you have to behave that way. There's a difference. So one is rationally responsive to the demands of the environment and survival of the group and the organism. The other is we do it this way because we do it this way, and don't ask any questions or you're going to get the back of my hand or the bottom of my foot. Those are different.
Maybe in the second case, there is a reason, but it's so far removed
Right.
from the actual experience
Right.
that it doesn't come out of any
That's right.
self-regulatory process.
That's right.
It's,
Yeah, absolutely good. That's a good emendation to that. Yeah. So when, and ostensibly, and I'm not going to go into as much detail as this as I would, under other circumstances, because I want to move it along. But what really emerged when I presented, or when I began to build this, and what I've come to use is what we call what I call a tripartite developmental model. And out of this grows the idea that essentially you have, most of you know this, but I put it up on the board here. And think you can you hear me still? Dr. Schiff?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So I'm putting this 3-line, my famous schema, which nobody's made a t-shirt for me yet. I'm waiting for that someday. I'll have to do it myself. Okay, it's Dr. Reich. If he said I would like a T-shirt, someone would get it for him. But really, I got it.
Baker isn't here.
Yeah, but the core, which is essentially the biophysical reality of the organism, is then naturally generates and interacts with the socio-cultural reality of the environment, or we might call this environment, okay, on many different levels, okay? See, I had tended to call it socio-cultural. I'm realizing now that it's more than socio-cultural, it's environmental, because it's not, that the social cultural reality really is the filter through which the environment, the human organism or any organism encounters the environment. So it's really a functional identity, again, in ergonomic terms, between the social and cultural organization of how one engages biologically the environment. So these two areas are constantly in phase if it's a healthy organism. This produces through internal mechanisms, experience, which gets processed psychologically, as we call it, and emotionally or perceptually, or feelingly, however you want to. We have a huge vocabulary to talk about that experience. It's not just psychological. It's the internal experience of this process going on. It's our perceptions of this process, whether it works or doesn't work, whether it feels good or it doesn't feel good. It really doesn't matter what it is, but we all develop experiences through this interaction of our core biophysical experience with the environment, and then we have mechanisms which Freud and then Reich elaborated on, and I think those remain fairly, I think the idea that we can describe the mechanisms by which we become personalities that deal with our environment are fairly available, and they're not very radical. And I think essentially in Reich's work it's available, and I think in many ways what I think Bowlby, and that's where I move on to Bowlby, I think what Bowlby offers is, or Stern or a number of others, is the possibility of understanding these broader processes in detail, of really looking. What Reich tended to do, I think, was to lay out the bigger theoretical, the bigger issues of organismic function and natural function. He had less patience in many ways to lay out detailed descriptions of how it actually worked. And if one looks at how Reich worked, he tended, much like Freud and others, who are even Darwin and others, who tended to say, okay, now someone else can fill in the dots or fill in all the spaces in between, because I'm moving on to the next major category, major issue. So when I came to think about and study John Bowlby, I found what was extremely interesting in Bowlby, and when I say Bowlby, I really mean basically people involved with attachment theory, and they come from a number of different directions, from biological, biophysical aspects of attachment.
What is attachment theory?
Well, I'm going to get to that. Okay, and a number of them come from a naturalist perspective, a number of them come from the psychoanalytic, psychological perspective, some from the educational world. But the founder, in a sense, or the key figure in this was really John Bowlby. Attachment, in many ways, is a superheading for a broad range of behaviors that maintain that really maintain stability in developing organisms. And it's also a way of beginning to understand the mechanisms for biophysical developmental process and how the organism integrates into the environment that will either sustain it or threaten it, right? And what Bowlby begins to point out is very clearly that that these processes are deeply rooted in biological behaviors and developmental processes that are wired into the organism. So that at birth, every organism has one prime directive. It's not just survival, which is, in a sense, the overall directive, but in pursuit of survival, its prime impulse is to stabilize, to become stable, secure, and connected. And in that respect, I think it's a very interesting connection to Reich's idea of contactfulness. That contactfulness is the internal experience of an organism that has successfully found a connection environmentally that secures it. In that context, Bowlby and his colleague Mary Ainsworth really emerged with a concept that I think is very useful here called the secure base. And what, in quick terms, this really involves is the idea that the newborn organism seeks to remain at ease. And I think here also Reich's ideas on the function of the orgasm and energetic function and pulsation are very useful, although Bowlby eschews that and tries to stay away from that because he feels it's too controversial an issue. But ostensibly, what happens is the organism is in need primarily not so much of food. The original thought was that babies seek care from their caregivers mainly to get fed, and that in fact Bowlby can quickly demonstrate that that's not the case, and the data supports that. That the young of most primates do not only seek the care of a caregiver for food. There are a huge number of instances where it has nothing to do with hunger, and where the evidence really supports that. What they're really seeking is protection, is the safety, in a sense, a sphere of safety that allows them to operate comfortably and securely. And that the caregiver's role is to facilitate and to allow that kind of environment to be dependable. So that as the young organism goes through this developmental process that we talk about, it becomes confident in and secure in that it can begin through these processes of internalization to begin to feel that they can rely on their caregivers to support them under stressful circumstance. The model which Bowlby offered most effectively, I think, is the image in looking at animals at nature. If we look, say, at great apes, at chimps, and this, I think, applies clearly to humans in nature, too. We see this behavior. The females or the group is playing in an open area after feeding, and the children are playing. Play is a crucial operative in this, and we've talked about that before. And there's some perceived noise, a loud noise goes off, whether it's a roar or some sign that there might be danger. At that point, right, the young are usually very, very disoriented. They're not sure at all what to do. The adults, particularly the females, the caregivers, the mothers, basically become immediately alert and signal through a series of cries that the child, the offspring, are to return to base, which means that it triggers a series of immediate responses which are back to and basically what happens, particularly in chimps or even the great apes, gorillas, the young run to the parent or the adult and jump on their back and grasp on, in which case there's possibility of flight, or once it's checked out, the adult indicates that no, it's okay, signals that we can return to at ease. At which point, if the signal is not flight, the young basically range out again back into a play environmental relationship with that's playful. These kinds of processes appear to be innate, although they are highly conditioned by the intercession of the caregiver in the environment, in the group, in the environment. That, in a sense, is the ideal, most primitive, and I mean primitive in the sense of simplest, presentation of how society and culture operates to organize individual behaviors. Okay? And that certainly operates in humans in nature, too, to the extent that we have a record of that. That secure base, it seemed to me, in the basic and simplest terms, really is about self-regulation. Okay, and what we are talking about when we look at individuals like individuals like Reich, concepts of self-regulation. Okay. Really grow out of that kind of sense of how the organism responds in a more one-to-one relationship with the environment, in which there isn't a great deal of compulsive intercession. And going back to what David Silver said, which is that there well might be later on in society good reasons why we tell our kids, don't go off with strangers, but rather than often, explain the full ramifications, we say, don't do it, and if you do it, you're going to be punished. Or if I catch you going off alone or not telling me where you're going, I'm going to beat the bejesus out of you, or I'll beat the bejesus out of you before you go off alone, so you'll remember. These kinds of attitudes, which are ultimately irrational, but underneath it have rational concerns. Okay, so that I think clearly, to finish up on the piece of Reich's point of view on this, that human animals have, by and large, lost the fundamental contact with their basic animal and biological function. Okay? If you look at a number of quotes from Reich, we could go, to many. Reich talks about this. This is a regular theme. But then it's no longer simply a matter of letting nature take its course, and that's the big, problem, because in fact nature is off course and blocked in us. So that one of the big mistakes of those who responded to these insights, of Reich's or Neil's, was that the assumption was, particularly in the 60s, is you let nature take its course, let's go back to nature, and everything is going to be all right. And there we go to Reich's famous anecdote of saying that the problem with anarchists or anarcho-syndicalists and is the same as the problem with, in one sense, people committed to orgonomy, or these kinds of self-regulation, is the same problem as nudists. And the point being that the nudist believes that if you take your clothes off and go naked, right, in the world, that'll correct years of personal and historical, shame and guilt about one's body and sexual expression. When in fact, you go to nudist colonies, people are just as messed up sexually.
Reich felt that nudism was a form of sexual repression.
Yeah, but not because nudism in itself is. It's because people can't do it naturally. That the human in nature doesn't go and say, "I'm going to be nude now."
No. It's also looking at one female body.
No.
Could be very exciting, very attractive. Seeing 10 of them, you're like in a meat market, and that's
well. The difference is in nature. Say the bush people, because it's hot in the desert, they go naked. But it's not about. It's functional. It's not about sexuality. Sexuality is something that takes place naked or not. I always quote my favorite story of friends who worked with the bush people, the people I was close with, Mel Connor and his wife Margaret Shostak. One of the anthropology students brought a copy of Playboy to a bush camp to show the bush people, and it was the favorite object for the bush people, not for any of the reasons that it would be popular among us. For them, it was the funniest thing. It was like a Mel Brooks comedy. And what was funny is they couldn't imagine two things. Primarily, they couldn't imagine why anybody would need pictures of naked men or women, particularly women, and then they couldn't believe that anybody had bodies like that, because they were totally unreal bodies and totally useless bodies. Why would you want to be with a woman that had breasts that didn't hang and had no flesh to it and you couldn't use? They were not usable bodies, so therefore they were not attractive. It was just to them it was proof positive of how silly. These outsiders. There's a specific term in Bush for the visitors, the anthropologists that come, which roughly translates into like, nice jerks, a bunch of nice jerks. So anyway, but those kinds of realities I think are crucial. In this context, I think it's valuable to consider the work of Bowlby and those around him, meaning people like Ainsworth, Stern, Robertson, a number of others, and the attachment model for human development, which I've given some insight to. If we use attachment as a way of articulating and explaining what contact is, this becomes a key way to understand, one, what the mechanisms of contact are. Contact, therefore, equals attachment behaviors. In other words, if you're able to make genuine contact what you're able to do is either respond to the attachment behaviors of another, meaning someone who needs to be attached, needs, particularly the young, needs contact, needs a secure base, or it allows you to operate as a caring individual, okay, and express your care impulses in response to those attachment behaviors. I think that's describing the meaningful exchange that goes on in a contactful way. What the goal of contactfulness is also explained, therefore. Contactfulness will lead to the establishment of that secure base. And in one sense, I think very clearly you can, and this is where I think the cross-fertilization of these two ideas are very valuable. I do not think you can have, one of the biggest problems in origami is we talk contactfulness, with not a lot of description, although Reich refers a little bit to it in his discussions of the infant research project, but that you cannot, I think, have genuine contactfulness until you have a system in which, or individuals in which, a secure base can be operative. Genuine contactfulness requires a sense of security and a secure base. So I think that the key and the value of Bowlby's idea of secure base is that it really explains what is going on internally or psychologically or psycho-emotionally or psycho-behaviorally to allow for contactfulness. Contactfulness is possible only in a secure setting. And what you see in nature is that with all of the dangers of the environment that they live in, the setting of the group is exceptionally secure. The data supports that. Studies, which Bowlby was very aware of and Reich never had access to, of the levels of independence and secure operations and positive attachments with behaviors in bush people, let's say, or people in nature, hunters and gatherers, compared to Western children of the same age, is highly more secure. The test that was done classically is to have a mother and child of, say, 2 years, a toddler age, sit down and some 100 feet away or so have a very attractive object that the child wants presented, and then to watch how quickly the child leaves the mother with the mother's permission to go for the object without looking back to the mother, because every time the child looks back indicates that it's not secure, that it's not sure, it's not confident, and how fast the child goes to the object and engages with the object without running back to the mother or looking back to the mother. In bush society, there's no hesitation. The children just go for it, right? Once the mother tells them it's okay, that it's safe. In Western societies, across the board, it's constantly hesitant. It's constantly, children, even when they go for it, are always checking back, always moving back, going a little bit further. Or if they run for it, they grab it and run back to the mother. There's a greater anxiety, greater insecurity about that. The reason being, in bush society, children virtually have no doubt that an adult, particularly the mother, if not the mother, someone else, will be continuously and constantly available to them for anything. In bush society, in hunters and gatherers, the object is you raise children by responding to their needs. Exactly what we would say would spoil a child. They say children. In fact, there's a phrase in bush language that says basically children. This is the closest thing to their Dr. Spock manual. Children were born to be spoiled, meaning they were born to be given everything they need when they need it. So built into the whole approach is self-regulatory. However, in their societies, it's much more naturally self-regulatory. It's not like the child is going to need the latest PlayStation 2 with X number. The child, by this means the child cries because it's a little bit bored. You respond to it. Why would you want to let a child cry, because it's bored? Boredom is a terrible thing. And it's very easily corrected. You play with it. You pick it up. Remember Dr. Sobey once telling a patient an old patient of his, who had no idea of how to raise a baby. You know, the baby, she called him up, baby was crying, you know, and she said, I don't know how to stop it from crying. And he actually had a break, he went over, and he said, pick up the baby stopped crying. She said, how did you do that? It's an anecdotal, but it's true. How did he do it? He said, how did I do it? You pick the baby up. The baby's crying. You pick it up. It has a reason for crying. It's either it wants to be picked up or something has to be done. So it doesn't take a lot in one sense. And we laugh or we sort of giggle at that because it seems so obvious. But this was not it's not to put this woman down. This woman genuinely was at a loss. And Bowlby was also extremely useful there because what he demonstrates is that if as a child, which clearly this woman was not raised in a secure environment, did not have modeled behaviors of the mother, you know, to demonstrate how to operate in that kind of secure, contactful way, she had no clue, literally. Now, to some extent, this could be easily rectified by simple, you know, intervention. At least on that level, how much broader the problems were remain to be seen. Yeah, you had better.
I had an observation about spending a year in Japan apropos of treatment of children. There's a little bit of interesting variation there. I could offer that now.
Yeah. Well, why don't, if possible, if you can hold that, sure. that would be fine. Let me just quickly finish this and then get it to Dr. Schiff to see what he has to add. Okay, so then we can also begin to understand that an individual who is contactful, to go the other way, or contactively capable, or is cared for contactively or protected, becomes capable of self-regulation. That unless you exist in that kind of environment, you're not going to be able to self-regulate because it's not safe. You can't, that's the key. We assume that, we should let our kids self-regulate. But in some ways, if we let our kids if we encourage, and I think that's a problem we ran into very actively in terms of this work in the 60s and to some extent through the 70s in child-centered approaches, which is that we want to encourage self-regulation because we feel it's going to be a very good thing for our kids. So we offer self-regulation, and even to the extent, in some cases, it wasn't self-regulation, it was license. But let's assume that you give your kid a genuinely self-regulatory beginning, a start, and the child builds real confidence, real self-regulatory capacity. And then you put them in an environment that's extremely compulsive, extremely, contrary to that. And the child, our assumption that the child is going to be smart enough to figure out, well, I can be self-regulatory at home, or I can choose the situations that I can self-regulate in, but in other situations I have to pretend to be the other way. It doesn't work. Now, it works in certain ways, and it can eventually work its way out. Sobi and I and a number of other the therapists had discussions about this, and looking at kids over a broad range of time who've been raised this way, many of them finally figure it out, but not without, some rough times, in a sense, to try to get the balance. Because, in fact, you get a kid who, is raised with the idea that, look, if you don't agree with an adult, there's no, the idea that you're compelled to accept the adult's views, whether you like them or not, or whether you think the adult is a fool or not. That's very, positive, as long as it's done respectfully, blah, blah. The kid gets to school and the teacher says something that's stupid and wrong, and the kid says, basically that's stupid and wrong. Respectfully, you're a nice teacher, but you're really wrong. The American Revolution didn't happen for this reason, or didn't happen for that reason. It was really this. And the teacher says, how dare you? And you get these kinds of conflicts. And in some cases, the child can be extremely punished. It depends. If it's a relatively healthy environment, school, the levels of compulsion, levels of penalty might be minimum, but more often than not, they can be sadistic. It then encourages other children to target them because they're clearly not part of the group, and they become isolated, and it encourages a kind of conflict. So we do create a kind of problem in doing this, which is not to say, therefore, we shouldn't, attempt to do this. It has to be done in a context, I think, of awareness that self-regulate, to be capable of self-regulation, there must be the secure base. So a secure base equals the capacity for self-regulatory relationship, or the possibilities of self-regulatory relationships. The feelings of security, in a sense, and here is I'm making a kind of link here. I think that these feelings of security, or operating in a secure corridor or secure environment, produce pleasure and produce the ability, and here's where I think the value of the link to Reich's work is extremely genuine here, produces a situation in which the pulsatory process, or Reich's function of the orgasm, the tension charge formula that we all know about, or most of us know about, I assume, and that energetic processes can operate. Interestingly, Bowlby eschewed that. I mean, he was very uncomfortable with issues of instinct and energetic process, although I think he was more sensitive to it than is immediately apparent. I think he just didn't feel comfortable, one, because he wasn't sure that these energetic processes were, and I know I've had personal contact and discussions with Daniel Stern, who felt that there was no evidence of energy and existing in the organism, so therefore it wasn't worth talking about. So in a sense they avoid it, but I think they talk about nonetheless the issues of deep gratifying contact that operate through this kind of secure environment. So they, in a sense, avoid the issue of energy and pulsation, but basically talk about the terms for us in which these functions operate. And nonetheless, both come to the same conclusion, that these situations, when aligned and when operative, produce a state of ease and balance and pleasure, and that and gratification. And of course, there are many behaviors in the young where this becomes operative, and things like breastfeeding, active play, engagement, and then even the process of growth in the world, if done in this kind of secure environment, which allows for this kind of process of tension and charge, becomes more capable. And then the individual develops the ability, and here's the last comment, develops the ability to struggle in the world effectively. And what I mean by that is not to be miserable in the struggle, but to struggle environmentally in an effective, productive way. Now, I think that's an overall skeletal presentation of that kind of model. I would point out, interestingly, just as a sideline, I have mentioned this before, that I did discover over the years, I have to do more research on this and get more data, that Bowlby did know of Reich's work. He certainly knew of Neil's work. It turns out that Bowlby, the year that Bowlby decided to become a child psychiatrist, a developmental psychiatrist, he had spent that summer working at Summerhill, with Neil, and he writes that he was inspired by the work of Neil to pursue his work with children. So first he thought about becoming a teacher, but then decided to go into psychiatry. So clearly there are links here that need to be explored, but I think there are genuine, that for me, this is the model that I work with. Okay. Now, do you want to take the ball now, Dr. Schiff?
Sure.
And then we can throw it open to general comments and questions.
Okay. Well, as usual, what's as usual? As usual, when I come and listen to Dr. Lewis's presentations, one, I always love them. I'm a big fan of Dr. Lewis, his presentations, and so it's always enjoyable for me.
It's going to be $100 a ticket next time.
Really. Always enjoyable for me to listen, and the other thing is I always find that he really covers all the bases, and really in laying out a kind of a skeleton, or really laying out what the important themes are. I always find that, when it's time for me to present something, if I'm going to follow up on something, it's already been said or already been pointed to in the presentation. So the other thing I also find is that I might not want to take all that much time in really making a few points, but what what impresses me about this model, and where I agree so much of it, is it really challenges what at sometimes one might become confused about in the idea of self-regulation. Oftentimes the idea of self-regulation is an isolated self. There's a thought, well, the person can just handle themselves in an isolated way. They can deal with their own energetic imbalances. And oftentimes that doesn't include or bring in really what is required in the external environment, in the culture, whether it's as for the infant, the parenting culture, for the child who moves out, or the broader culture, the school culture, the family culture, the culture of relationships as an adult. It doesn't bring in what that culture needs to be able to do in order to support healthy functioning or self-regulation, as we're speaking about here. This model addresses that, and I think addresses that, in a very direct way. So another way of saying it, and where attachment theory comes in, and I agree totally here, is that attachment theory brings in how society or how the base has to be able to respond in order for the organism to be able to function in a way that becomes self-regulatory, but in a way in which everything is moving, where there is a sense of pleasure or relaxation, where there's an ability, as Bowlby spoke about, to explore, to expand out into the world. And it can only happen, as been noted, if there is a feeling of safety. Now, what I just want to say is that is something that is not only necessary for the young infant, but it's yet necessary for organisms as they mature. Yes, the basis of developing an inner sense of being able to self-regulate in that capacity starts very early on. But if the culture, all these different cultures, these changing cultures, do not continually provide those kind of secure bases, then the organism is going to have to maintain itself within some sort of a chronic state of contraction, i.e. protection, i.e. lack of ability to expand, i.e. chronic armor. So what Bowlby was able to see or speak about in terms of how that the basic animal, very young, kind of runs toward the mother or the caretaker whenever there's danger. In other words, when the organism is about to contract, they move toward the protecting figure, and then within that safety, they can go and expand again. That becomes very easily seen between mothers and infants, human mothers and infants, and very easily seen throughout the developing lifespan.
Let me just see there, that also it means that the infant is free, or the child is free, to go to the mother and maintain its contraction appropriately and with validation if there's a real rational reason for the contraction to exist without being punished or threatened for contracting. It's very important because there could be real reasons for the child to have to contract. It could be even reasons that are necessary for its security, and the mother has to. So you can see this in terrible situations where you'll see parents, a kid gets hurt or a kid gets threatened, and the response of the parent is, no, you got to go back out there and be tough, and don't come running to me and being a baby, or a sniveling, little wimp, and that kind of brutality, which is essentially, encouraging a kind of compulsive.
Right, but already in talking about that, you're already speaking about a situation where the mother is not operating as a good attachment figure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
Because what would happen naturally is that the child or the animal would come toward mother, okay, or caretaker, would be provided this kind of safety, and then when he or she feels safe, would naturally move out. They
Right.
wouldn't have to be encouraged to move.
Right.
And if you look, so the other thing that always strikes me in this and then bringing in society, if you really look at that behavior pattern, you are looking between the dyad as a form of contraction and expansion in itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
When earlier Dr. Lewis was saying or describing how when there's danger, you might see the animal, the mother animal, let out a cry and communicate to the infant or the young animal, just in the same way you might have the young animal let out some cry and communicate to the mother or the caretaker. What you're seeing then is that both of them become responsive to a danger and they come together. And what's really fascinating then, if you look at just in natural societies, that when there's danger, there is a natural contraction within the society. There's a coming together. There is a sense of being able to support one another. And then, during periods of safety, if you take again this bird's eye view, the organism of the environment expands. They go apart. So you're seeing not only the idea of self-regulation just embedded in the self, but it's embedded in the whole society, or the dyad if we're looking at the mother or parent and child. And there's a capacity for mutual cueing. However that takes place,
Mutual what?
Cueing.
kind of mutual signaling to one another, and being able to read those signals that they can develop, they can almost operate as a unit. We see that very clearly, with infants, that's the whole thing with crying. Why do you respond to crying? Well, mother or parent hears the cry, that becomes a cue, a signal, and then there's a responsiveness. And naturally, the responsiveness would be to come toward, to make contact, and contact meaning in this sense, being able to do something to relieve whatever the distress is. And then the crying stops, the signal is terminated, and then that leads for going apart. But it requires, and this was brought up in Dr. Lewis's presentation, it requires that both members of that dyad can respond to what their internal needs are and can also respond to the cueing and the signaling in the outer environment. Just to briefly say, from studies that have been done, and there's attachment theory in terms of the world of psychology is a very popular theory. It's a very popular theory in terms of trying to understand, how people function or don't function. It's been kind of extended into trying to understand relationship problems because this clearly is and grounded in relationship. And what is usually thought of is that if they look at individuals who have very profound anxiety or depression, who have very severe relationship problems, that oftentimes one can begin to trace that back to the lack of having that kind of security or early kind of attachment in their caretaking environment. And this is not only done retrospectively by having the adult patient, client, individual talk about what happened in their lives, and then there's a retrospective kind of analysis of that, but there's very good data in terms of observing children, observing the quality and kind of interaction they have with their caretakers, how well that caretaker is able to respond to those cueing signals and provide the kind of security that allows the child to then be able to feel relaxed, expand, move out into the world, and engage in those behaviors that we would see in a healthy kind of sparkling, alive child. And it's that when you see how the attachment person functions to be able to provide that, or the lack of that, and then follow those children, you see increasingly more distressed individuals as they grow up. Now, one can, just to kind of say, well, what exactly happens there? Why does the early attachment provide the capacity for later self-regulation, or provide the corollary or the inverse of that, not allow for self-regulatory behavior later on or for more anxiety later on. And one would say that, and this is exactly what Dr. Lewis pointed out, and let me just say that in just another way, as I mentioned earlier, that within a state of fear, which is really what moves the individual toward the other, there's a danger. So there's a fear and there's a coming together. In a state of fear that cannot be then let go of, cannot be then released, you remain chronically contracted. And that is what armoring is. So, if very early on the infant can then have this kind of pulsation, they can have some fear, they contract, they have the base that allows them to expand, and then they expand out, then they contract again because there will be natural dangers, and then they go out, and then they develop internally a sense of security. Not only at that time that the world is secure, but then that they have a capacity to recover from fear, to contract and expand, then that becomes organized within their system. Psychologists speak about that in terms of mental processes, working kind of models. Like, I know that I will be secure. I know that I can survive. I know I can go toward people and they will help me. But I think there's another thing that's going on. Is actually a biological anchoring. That kind of pulsation is becoming ingrained within the organism and allowed. So there is a kind of a biological anchoring of this kind of capacity for pulsation, for safety, for coming inward and moving outward, as well as being able to turn toward a significant other and come toward them for safety and move outward as well. That provides a capacity for later self-regulatory behavior. And in addition, what that provides for, and you can look at it in terms of organically, you can look at it in terms of models, is it provides for the person to then seek out in the world others that can provide that kind of contact that they had very early on in life. And I think that's crucial. And as a therapist, what always impresses me, and it's not unique, and I think one can read it by so many different therapists and theorists, the healthier a person is, usually the healthier the people are that they surround themselves with. Because most of us aren't all that healthy, of course, not everyone, we're going to surround ourselves with be all that healthy, but there's kind of a gradient. So, the patients who come in to me for therapy who tend to have had much more horrendous upbringings, and very poor sense of security and trust or attachment figures tend to surround themselves with individuals where the drama repeats itself. And as a person becomes healthier in their life and becomes contact with, hey, this makes me feel better. This allows for this contraction to let go. This provides safety for me. Hey, I'm being understood. I am having contact. Then old relationships drop out. New relationships form. Maybe sometimes even less number of relationships, but relationships that really provide those kind of attachment behaviors and attachment kind of connections that we still need as adult organisms. That happens always across the board. And it makes sense, because essentially what we do as we become healthy is we provide and build our environment as best we can within, as was well said, an armored environment. But we build as best we can that own kind of smaller environment which allows us to be able to pulsate as best and as fully as we can. So that being said, I think I'll just stop for this moment and kind of be interested to hear your reactions, Harry, and then maybe be open for questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I really, again, I think you responded to a number of the things, strands that I laid out. I have nothing more to add right now. Around the table here, there are individuals who want to make comments. So why don't we let people comment or question, and then you and I or others can respond. Did you want to just identify yourself with Dr. Schiff and then just make your comment?
This is Chris Lewis.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
Good.
Nice to hear your voice.
You too. I want to respond to something that you said, Harry, and I just want to double check that I caught it right. That you used the expression across the board in Western cultures. What I thought you were describing as behavioral expressions of children of disturbed contact and attachment, where the anxiety levels of kind of independent wandering or autonomous behavior are higher and requiring more or high.
Well, I was commenting on the fact that in general, when we look at, I don't know if it's just Western societies, I think in general, when we look at at complex human societies, more socially armored human societies, you see a great deal more insecurity in engagement and lack of independence, genuine independence. What often gets distorted in this is that our values are we want children to be individuals. We don't really want, and by what we mean in our society, and I think this is true in a number of Asian societies too, is that it's not independence in the sense of genuine, secure, independent, confident behavior, but it's independence in terms of looking out for and seeing one's, importance as a self. In a sense, it encourages a kind of self-interest rather than a socially gregarious engagement. So I think
this is what I thought I remembered you saying. And then there's I spent here too.
Are you there?
Dan?
Dan?
Hello?
We lost him, I guess. Hello? Hello?
That's weird.
He might have just hit a button by mistake and
No.
disconnected himself.
Oh, he might. That's true. Let me redial.
There's no redial button. Okay. Was it 523?
523-0800.
Hello.
Hi, you got disconnected?
Yeah, I cut myself off here.
Okay.
Yeah, so, having spent a year in Japan teaching English, I was really fascinated with what I observed there with how infants and toddlers and preteens, emphasis on preteens, are treated. That contradicts in a little bit in what you've said, but when taken in the context of how teens come to be treated, makes the point in a broader way. But they certainly give an appearance of having a very high tolerance of infant and childhood spontaneity, expression, curiosity, expression of emotion, and that there's a radical shift in that when it comes to adolescence, and it's almost like there's an incredible compartmentalization, whereas maybe in Europe and America there's kind of a distribution of disturbance of the primary expression over the entire development process. In Japan you can see compartmentalization, and just make two things I observed are worth hearing about, I believe. One was watching a child of about 5 climb up on the top of the back of a chair, and everybody being totally comfortable with it, and me in my kind of American anxiety way going, feeling intervene, and then kind of watching my own anxiety about that, and watching everyone else's comfort about the security of this child in its own sense of gravity and the parents' confidence in it as well. One of the brief story is, or in general, when you see children having tantrums in public, this is not a problem. And I had one Japanese friend there who had said, she worked in a hardware store, and she said, this American couple came in one day and with their kids, and one of them, and they were running around and having a grand old time, and the father very sternly spoke to the oldest of the three kids about, this is not a playground, and you're going to look after your younger brother and sister, and I want to, and she just didn't get it. She goes, what was up with that? And whereas that kind of behavior is they have this kind of compartmentalized part of their society in childhood where that's okay, but only in childhood.
The Japanese, I think that's the key phrase. It's only in childhood. Japanese data is very interesting in terms of what it produces. Childhood in Japan, contrary, I think what you're missing to some extent in what you present is that, maybe you saw this when you were there, the Japanese attitude towards childhood are high while they allow a great range of freedom for children in a certain sense. It's really structured around an incredible sentimentalization about children. In other words, it's not nearly as benign and nor is it as nearly tolerant. It's often tolerant in ways that as Americans we don't understand. I mean, in other words, a kid can climb fairly freely, kid can run fairly freely, and so we see, boy, they really allow their kids a great deal of freedom. We see far less the interaction in the interpersonal reactions at home. And as Dr. Bowlby always pointed out, the key is really not whether you restrict the child from climbing on a chair or running free in the park. It's really what's done in terms of the genital function of the children and what's also expected of the child. Part of what children are indulged in Japan incredibly, in terms of young children, but they're also expected to produce.
But this is the message. This is the message of that they get in adolescence.
I think it starts with
I had no intention to romanticize what I observed about childhood or considered unproblematic, but it's like the distribution of moral regulation as opposed to self-regulation. It's distributed differently over time.
According to Reich, if they were not severely sexually repressed as infants, they would never stand for the other stuff when they became adolescents.
That's interesting.
That's true too, but I think also what's often missed in the Japanese data, since there's an Americanization, America has this kind of romance about the Japanese and the Japanese way of doing things. A fascinating study in Japan came out about 10 years ago, and has been followed up, of pre-adolescent, not adolescent, pre-adolescent school children. Asked to draw pictures and a number of psychological tests to show about attitudes on aggression and hostility, and the Japanese were like totally astounded and very distressed to learn that the vast majority of these kids had incredible levels of aggression towards parents and desire and rage towards parents and impulse to kill and hurt adults, particularly school teachers, authority figures. So, yeah.
Well, let's also not forget Japanese animation makes ours look tame, even the most extreme.
You have to also understand that the Japanese culture produces the highest, is probably the single, well, not only that, but is the single largest pornography and violent pornography and child pornography market in the world.
Certainly not blind to that. And again, it goes to the point of this kind of radical shift of mores from
I would argue,
to adolescence.
But I would argue that it's. I mean, and we could get into a long thing. I would argue that it's there probably well before adolescence. But that, I mean, I've watched numerous Japanese programs of sort of the wonderfulness of children, and they'll have these programs in which kids do the funny things, and there's a lot. I think underneath I think there are some decent, genuinely caring relationships, but I think there are a very complex set of messages that go on beyond just the fact that children are wonderful, children are great, children, and then go into, but we can get, let Karen and we'll get.
Doesn't stop me from loving sushi, however.
That's good.
But I'm going to get away from I want to go back to something Dr. Schiff said. I have a question that he found, I believe he said across the board, that people who were raised with a very, let us say, non-self-regulatory upbringing, very little contact, across the board went after a partner who was in the same situation. Why wouldn't they go for something the total opposite, feeling the need for what they had missed in there? Did you ever find, why does it go that way? Why don't they go for the opposite?
Okay, first of all, if I said across the board with that, I have to retract that. I don't want to say that anything is really across the board in that kind of. I think it tends to be more a tendency of what I see. There's just so much variability that to make such a strong statement just bears itself for clear cases of refuting that. Okay, but let me try to understand your question. You're saying, why does one tend to want to go in their relationships and replicate that versus going for the opposite? Is that
right, to fulfill the need that they lost, that they never had?
Well, I think what often happens is here are a few ways that people have looked at it. One way is that we develop certain kind of models or ideas of how relationships are. And because we have these ideas, we then kind of go and structure our environment to fit into those ideas.
And this is not conscious.
Yeah. So these are called like unconscious or working kind of models. And so therefore it tends that we tend to replicate. We tend to replicate those things that we say we never want to do or want to be in, but we have them anyway. Okay, I think that's one possibility of why we tend to do that. The other possibility is that our organism is accustomed to a certain kind of environment and a certain kind of way in which we react. If we kind of put ourselves into another kind of environment, sometimes let's say a much more healthy environment, it could arouse too much in terms of too much sense of expansion.
Too much anxiety.
Which would be too much anxiety. And therefore, almost the paradox is that even though we're in situations where it's painful and where we clearly are in distress, that can be, in a way, preferable to this kind of anxiety in terms of being expanded or in a situation where we cannot handle what would come up. So that's why we tend to, take in another context, keep continuing abusive kind of behavior, which from even in a rational sense we kind of say we're doing this abusive kind of behavior, but we can't stop because of this whole kind of organismic mechanism.
This would explain why, for instance, the common phenomena in dealing with abused children is how incredibly or abused spouses or mates, how incredibly attached they often are to the object of their, the person who's abusing them, the individual who's abusing them. So that I think the patterns are. I think Karen's looking for a rational explanation as to why you would do that. Rationally, of course, it doesn't make any sense. But once you're in this kind of dynamic, you're not looking at a rational, healthy developmental process. So it doesn't necessarily replicate. I sometimes add to this the old animal behaviorist view, particularly expressed by I learned about my dog up in the country years ago. When my dogs would go out constantly, run wild, and come back quilled by porcupines. And I was speaking to a farmer and said, I don't understand. I thought dogs learn Pavlovian. It gets quilled, and it should learn that the porcupine is something to leave alone. He said, no. Dog is smart. It does learn. It learns that porcupine is a son of a bitch, and it's going to go back out there and get that porcupine and kill it. It just doesn't get that each time it gets killed.
There's another rationale, and this is not what I really wanted to say, but I just want to comment on Karen's thing.
Oh, would we speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, he's out the other end of the
This is
table.
Norm Grossman here.
Hello.
Hi. If you had, say, a father that was cold, and that you were not able to get any contact with, as an adult, what you would be doing is continually trying to get contact from your father. So you would choose a mate that is similar to your father, and try and get contact.
That's the porcupine approach.
Yeah, and try and get contact from that person, because you'll spend the rest of your life not trying to get contact. If your father had been contactful, you wouldn't need to do that.
It just struck me that I was just talking to my sister, and I guess we were talking not from a biophysical point of view, but just the fact that each of us chose husbands that were opposite to our father, who was just simply not there, and we chose husbands who are, by God, there.
Yeah, well, we're not going to get into doing analysis, but
so I was wondering if there are others who go that we tend to all go that direction.
But the question has less to do with who the actual physical or descriptive. I think that's Dr. Schiff is pointing out, that's why you don't want to make these broad statements that it never. But that often in those relationships, it's really not who you choose, but how you work within the relationship once you choose that person. So that very often, by all apparent presentation, objectively, the individual who you choose doesn't look at all, behave at all like the parent that you're responding to, but that when you look at the dynamic of how the two of you relate, there's often that kind of problem that becomes the central problem in the relationship, which is, despite the fact that you finally choose a guy who's very available, very caring, very giving, you can't ever get to a point where you feel you're getting that, even though the person seems to be exactly that kind of person. So because the problem is not with the person you choose, it's the model that you've internalized. So that even when somebody, it's a little bit like, again, it's the image with the dog. The dog who is genuinely armored. If you have a dog that's healthy, you step on its tail, it gets angry and it barks at you, and then when you calm it down, it rolls over and lets you rub its belly. If the dog has been brutalized, anytime you walk near it, it's up, and attacking you, even though you're very sweet and loving. So it's a question really less of who you choose than what you bring to the relationship, and that's always the complex set of values.
Right. I think that's an excellent point. And I think the other point to keep in mind is that though we're speaking of, one set of people, like one parent or both parents, throughout the course of our development, we have a number of different attachment figures that we come into contact with.
I don't
we don't just have one model, we have at times competing models.
I think that's very, very important and often not given enough attention either by us or also by, even in the literature, even in the serious literature, is there's often discussion of what we call secondary attachment figures, and even Bowlby's writing there's an interest in it, but it's sort of like not as interesting as the primary attachment relationships. And in fact, I think secondary attachment figures and secondary attachment relationships, both with other parents, other adults, relatives, and then as you move out socially into the larger social environment with teachers or other, and then siblings, and then to some extent friends, are very, very crucially important and not looked at really enough. It's looked at in other literature about role models and stuff, but in terms of attachment behaviors, there tends to be a primacy of focus on primary relationship. And in orgonomy, there's a tendency to look at primary relationship as central, and I think it is, but I think there's a lot to be gained by looking at more extended issues of secondary relationships, not as inferior, but as crucial. And the other, which would also, I think, explain something about going back to the Japanese model, which is that there's a lot that goes on, particularly in the external social environment, particularly in the schools, that has a primary role in preparing what's going to happen when they move into adolescence. I think that plays a key role. The schools particularly are an extreme, and the willingness of the Japanese structure to see to the external social operatives of school and authority and community for the discipline of and the preparation of young children is a crucial aspect of the cultural organization. So I think these are key issues. And secondary attachment figures, secondary contact figures are, I think, very, very important. Norm has been very patient.
Yes, I'm chanting it a bit.
Okay, and wants to.
In my early child-rearing years, I diligently scoured Reich's writings for some instruction.
Right.
How do you raise your child?
Right.
What do you do? What do you do when this happens? There's nothing that
God
I've
bless
ever
you.
read. I've read almost
Right.
everything he's
That's
written.
right.
He never says one word
That's right.
on how to do it. And I began to realize as I got older that that's on purpose.
Right, absolutely. I
He
spoke to
doesn't
Sophie
do
about
that, and I believe I probably did too. He does it because there is no way.
Right.
You can't tell someone that an infant desperately needs deep contact. And to give them deep contact, you can't tell someone to do that. They either can do it or they can't, or they can do it to a certain extent, and to the extent that they can give the infant that contact, that infant will be satisfied, greater or lesser. And that's the beginning and end of it. These how-to models, as far as I understand right, are useless and maybe can do harm.
They're dangerous, actually.
To say that you can give self-regulation to your child, you can't. It's like peddling freedom, as Reich would say. You can't do it. The child is self-regulated to the degree that you are. Maybe a little bit better because you're going to try a little harder, but nevertheless, you can only do what you're capable of doing. And the young organism, no matter what you say or what you do, really has pretty deep contact with what's inside of you and knows you can do this, but he knows that you're full of crap. And so what your actions, conscious actions, are less important as to what you are really capable of. And the other thing that I wanted to comment on is that also my understanding from Reich about armoring, and this is one of the things that bother me about some of the writings that you've discussed, is that it's not an absolute. Reich said there are absolutes for something that he didn't like. One is not absolutely armored or unarmored. Right. To the degree that you are able to cast off armorings that you have and respond in an unarmored situation and be soft, that's the degree of health that you would have. But as far as walking down the street, you have to armor. Right. And it's not a question of armoring because there's a danger here and there. It's a question of being able to shed your armor when it's appropriate to shed your armor. And that's the difference.
Yeah, we comment that this is the difference between being armored, chronically, and armoring, which is a natural, healthy. Reich makes this point numerous times. I think, let me comment on this thing about manuals or advice. Reich actually does address the issue. It is very intentional that he offers no. He does this in many cases. It's also very intentional that he offers no guidelines to how to do treatment. He doesn't say, do this, do that. Contrary to, say, someone like Ellsworth Baker, Man in the Trap, says, well, if you got this kind of problem, do this. Press here. Do this. You'll get this. Yeah. Contrary to that, Reich would point out that, look, the only thing you can do is understand the dynamics and really figure it out as you go along, and it varies broadly with all sorts of range of problems. Similarly, with these issues, I think Reich is very clear that one is, you said it very clearly, it depends on your ability to be in contact, and be create a secure base. But I think also the problem with manuals or advice is that very often, as Reich said, what we go back to are these patterns that we've modeled, and here's what I think where Bowlby and others are very useful, is that what we wind up when we try to figure out how to deal with this problem or that problem, we go to models that we've internalized as we've gone through it, which often can be disastrous, and we maybe work on them and try not to do as much disaster. But the idea that self-regulation can be taught or can be legislated or can be advised, it leads to great complex problems. I mean, Dr. Bowlby used to love to point out, and I think she understood it, but his favorite was to describe his second wife, Francine Bowlby, who was a very brilliant woman. I worked with her, and really studied self-regulation, read about it, and felt she understood it. Certainly, she probably understood it better than most of us theoretically. And he used to laugh and say, and then she, with their own children, she would sit there and try to figure out how and when and what kind of schedule she could set up to follow the self-regulatory patterns of her children. That you could figure this out and it could work on us. And he would sit there and try to say, no, you don't get it. There was no point. She could not get it at all, even though theoretically she could understand exactly what Neil, Reich, and everyone else had to say. So, and in all fairness, myself, I'm sure Dr. Schiff, all of us would say that we wind up doing the best we can. And I think that's a crucial, and if we do less harm, if we do less harm than there has been done to other children, either to us or others, then we've made gains. The other thing, just let me quickly add here, is that anecdotally, it would be nice if we had the ability again. This is I call it the Rothenberg mantra, which is we don't have the facilities to do the kind of research necessary in looking at this. But anecdotally, one of the last seminars that I held with the therapist and Dr. Bowlby, we discussed this issue of children who had been raised in a, quote, self-regulatory, or an attempt at some sort of model of a healthy attachment, self-regulating process, that Dr. Bowlby, having had years of experience watching these kids, and now myself having enough years to see it, pointed out that very interesting, it came up because one of the doctors was presenting a case of a kid who was having a lot of problems, was on the verge of possible hospitalization, and why the kid was raised. The parents really worked hard, the parents were really sincere, what was going on, and it turned out the kid wound up doing pretty well. But Dr. Bowlby said that. He said that when you looked at the broad range of kids raised in these more, in quotes, progressive patterns, that very often when you looked at them, particularly in the early years, pre-adolescent and adolescent years, they often had much more, they didn't do as well. Even though they might be bright, they might be more skilled, but they often had school problems, they would have relation problems, they appeared to be much more troubled than a lot of their peers who, did it right. That interestingly, that most of these kids, and I've come to see this over the years, most of these kids, not all, but most of these kids, as they get older, wind up doing better than one you would expect necessarily, but also often better than their peers in many respects, not necessarily in all respects. And again, I'm not making this as a broad predictive generalization, but I think what happens is that this ties into a interesting, again, unfortunately anecdotal, although a little bit more interesting data-based observation of kids who went to Summerhill. And following up the children of Summerhill the cohort of Summerhill students in later life, going back to the beginning of Summerhill all the way through. So you have a pretty good number of students. The level of success and relative, becoming well-adjusted in society and productive is very, very high. But again, it's anecdotal. It's following up. It's hard to say how absolute that is. But the one consistent thing that Neil, for instance, was always extremely proud of is that descriptions of Summerhill students when they go out into the world by people who didn't know they were Summerhill students, that always that these kids were incredibly confident. And in my experience, kids who have been raised by patients of mine who I've seen over the years, that they might have problems in becoming financially very successful, but they have a great deal of confidence in what they decide to do. It might take longer for them to get around to deciding what they're going to do and what they want to do with their lives.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
First of all, just a comment. One of the things I at least personally, I've learned from being a therapist all these years is how to be patient. Okay, so waiting has become something that's become pretty natural to me. But the second thing is that I see this from a different frame, and then I look at this a little differently. And I do think that attachment behaviors, the ability to attach, kind of ways in which a parent attaches and makes contact with their child can be modified. I think these things can be, quote, taught, if you want to use that term, and I think these things can be changed. I don't think they can be changed by manuals. I don't think one can read about it and apply it, because then that infers some sort of self-awareness about how we characteristically function, which we usually don't have. It's essentially, how can we read a manual and at the same time be cognizant of what our character issues are and then be able to change that. However, I think there has been increasingly interventions that are being done between parents and children at a very young age, in which parents begin to be able to see and recognize how they are relating to their children, and within a therapeutic context be able to see what it is that is moving them towards relating that way, and under the proper conditions they can change that.
Yes.
One of the things that's being very useful these days, and these are the kind of interventions that were not around 30 years ago, because there wasn't so much active treatment of infant parent dyad. We treated the parent, we treated the child. Now there's very much a very early active treatment of the infant and the parent, and they're using very importantly, they're using videotape technology as a way of beginning to show and give feedback. And parents can begin to see, because the videotape kind of operates as a, quote, observing ego, an outside kind of eye. Parents within a proper context can begin to see, hey, I did not respond. Hey, look, this child was crying, and I turned away, and can begin to modify their behavior. Now, I think, Norman brings up a very important point here, that, okay, if a person modifies their behavior, still is that going to modify how their deep character is? And is the child going to be able to pick up what's in the depth? Now, that's an important question, and I'm not sure about that. But I do think that enough modification can be had early on that can really change what could have been a very disruptive early attachment style development to a much more healthier one.
Yes, I think there, in keeping in mind, was what Reich's final recommendation is that this is a gradual evolutionary process of trying to reverse thousands and thousands of years of complex, distortion socially, and that in order to do that, you have to really think less in terms. We're concerned that does our kid turn out to be healthy and successful, et cetera, or is everything much better? But in fact, if we improve our child's experience, by a small amount, then it's contributory and it accrues over a period of time. And I do think that while manuals are less, or how-to books are less useful, or in some cases even potentially have negative impact, but I think that overall the impact of all this work, including much of Reich and Neal's approach, which has been not acknowledged as much, but has been incorporated in a lot of the sensibility, has produced a greater culture of intervention appropriately, and I think it can be very productive, and it produces some very positive things, and things certainly therapeutically. I think these are things that one can be supported in and can help. I just think that overall it's really a question of, whether you're going to be mechanical about it or sort of superimpose a set of standards. I mean, you can become a attachment fascist also. It's like, my wife would point out that, for instance, after years of struggle, we were able to get instituted, certainly in New York State, and it's pretty national now, that breastfeeding is encouraged. And that, in fact, in New York State, there's a law which requires every hospital to have a lactation specialist who is available and encourages patients, new mothers to breastfeed. And my wife said, you should see, the lactation specialist usually in the hospital, because you get paid extra, and you also get off of duties that are less appealing is usually a nurse who comes in who has no interest in lactation, particularly breastfeeding, but will come in and say, "Okay, it's time to breastfeed. You have to bond with your child now, and you have 15 minutes to do it." I mean, all right, but is it a gain? Yes, obviously. Is it really again, it's the same thing with, I think, child abuse regulations. Obviously, it's a major gain that we have laws that prevent, or criminalize or require intervention on child abuse. Does it produce, absurdities or even horror shows of people who are held responsible because they bounced their kid on their knee and the child giggled? And that's, I've had literally in conferences, specialists who insist that if you roll on your bed with your child and you both have pleasure in it, this is sexual abuse. I mean, you get these kinds of absurdities, but would you then do away with protecting children and setting laws? No, obviously not.
I just want to add to that, excuse me, because it's just so funny. I teach with a lot of young teachers, and these lactation specialists actually are teaching them how to pump.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
I find it,
Right,
so frustrating
That's
because.
right. But again, the gains are really, slow and gradual. It took thousands upon thousands of years for us to get to the point where we need experts to tell us how to do things that deers in the woods do. It's not going to be reversed simply by some revolutionary new dogma. And I think the interesting thing about Bowlby, it always seemed to me, say in comparison to the way Reich worked. Reich was clearly a radical, and he had no bones about it, and was very, very, a vanguard kind of radical thinker on all sorts of levels. Bowlby, who was much, much more a retiring kind of figure, and I think in many ways, what's attractive about Bowlby's approach is saying, okay, well, we build this slowly. We introduce this slowly. He's not proposing a radical departure, although it's quite radical in many ways. But it becomes a much more gradualist rather than a more the lines are drawn. I think Reich himself felt that often that kind of position weakened his ability to access certain kinds of communities and venues, but it all contributes.
There is one more thing that I noticed in what you said about some of his remarks that feels to me as it is diametrically opposed to Reich's feelings about things. When they talk about a goal-oriented action, or that the infant has a desire for security and peace, that's not what I got out of Reich. He would say things like, the function of the hand is to grasp. The hand doesn't grasp in order to do anything.
Right.
That's
Bowlby
its
would
function.
agree with that completely.
He would. But the function of the child is simply when they feel at dis-ease, they express the feeling that
Absolutely.
they feel. They don't
absolutely
go.
consistent with Bowlby's work.
Then they're not goal oriented.
Absolutely. It's not. It is goal oriented, but not goal oriented in the sense of a Western concept of goal. The goal.
Not as far as the infant is concerned.
The goal for the infant. There's no conscious goal. The goal is the cessation of discomfort. In other words, it's not.
I don't even know if that's the goal. There's somebody expressing the discomfort. And then the parent
interprets
this as discomfort. And
the organism always seeks. Reich, I think, would consider that also seeks relaxation of tension naturally as a function, and so that it becomes a kind of. I mean, maybe I think the problem is terminology. The use of the word goal, certainly for many of us, bodes the sense of a Western concept of goal-directed, goal of achievement, of competition for the prize or stuff. That's not the way that Bowlby, as I understand, is talking about it.
I think what's exciting about Bowlby as well in this very context is that he brings in the models of ethology, and it brings in the whole broader context of evolutionary biology.
Right.
So thinking about these subjects are not the strictly kind of a medical biological model of Reich, but a natural historic one.
Well, I think Reich was actually pushing in that direction too, in many ways. Although I think he clearly emerged much more in a more clearly medically based or biologically based kind of science. But I think overall, what I get from Reich is a great deal. I mean, actually, what I find in the two models is a great deal of compatibility. The biggest area of disease, imbalance, is that Bowlby feels largely uncomfortable with discussions of energy and energy function and things like pulsation and biological energy. Not so much, as he says, because he's, I think he just feels uncomfortable with it. Ostensibly, he would argue that there's just no evidence of it existing, so therefore he pushes it aside and says, maybe it exists, it's not really my...
On the other hand, he obviously has not had the experience in his own body.
Well, we don't know. I have to ask him.
Well, he did, then
if I
he
could.
question.
Well, we don't. Right, but again, I mean, the issue is more a question from our perspective of what's available. I'm actually in the process over the years slowly building an idea for a biography of Bowlby, and there might well be some truth to what you're saying, but I don't know that in terms of this discussion, I think it's more interesting just to look at what's available. I think actually we're getting to. You want to make any last comments?
No.
Okay.
Oh, come on.
He wants to have his breakfast. It's very early.
Okay, yeah, 3 hours earlier there. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thank everybody there.
And we'll see you next. We'll pick up next year. Actually, before everyone leaves, I just want to talk about the fact that in the fall we're going to try to continue. I'm thinking of some new approaches. One of the things I'd like people to consider is that I've had the idea of there are these really wonderful recordings now on CD of hours and hours of Reich's lectures, which Dr. Schiff and I have actually been reviewing and discussing. And I was thinking of possibly offering within this venue, periodically, not every session, a period where we listen to some of the Reich material and discuss some of the issues that he brings up to broaden, since basically it's getting to the point that each go around I was just looking through my notes, I have like 30 or 40 lectures on various subjects, but most, since we don't get a new audience base that much, many of you have either heard it in one way or another over and over again. It's nice, to go over some of the material, but I was thinking of possibly creating more of a periodic study group to go and broaden the knowledge base, and possibly Dr. Schiff could even still do a hookup with us. So I'll work on that over the summer as a possible, at least one of the forms that this can take, unless we get a sudden, my idea of offering a door prize, of a hot Broadway ticket for everybody who comes.
That'll bring in a lot of sincere.
Yeah, well,
audience members.
who cares as long as they come
Pay
in.
their $15.
That's right. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We'll speak later.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll see you.
Anyone who owes me money, pay me.